I was considering the other day, you know, change is quite difficult, isn't it, for many of us, maybe for all of us, but change can also lead you back in a bit of a circle sometimes. But when we did our first equestrian sector in a changing world in 2017, one of the headlines of that year was the fact that the UK government triggered Article 50 to start Brexit negotiations. Come forward a decade, and we're now in advanced discussions around a revised SPS agreement. Sometimes you do go in a circle. So on that regard, it is wonderful that we have the Minister with us, Baroness Hayman of Ullock, who is a Minister for the Biosecurity, the borders and animal welfare, and obviously has a huge experience of both being in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, both as a shadow minister and now as the minister. So, Minister, thank you very much. I know you've got to leave us straight after your presentation, but we do really appreciate you making the time, and so the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Roly. And I'm sorry, I've got a question in the House. So as soon as I've finished, I've got to disappear. So I do apologise for not being able to stay with you. But thank you so much, Roly, and also to Georgina for inviting me to speak to you today. And I'm really pleased to be here. I was here last year, so I'm really delighted to be able to return again. And also, I'm also really delighted to be able to congratulate our GB equestrian teams for another successful year. The Agria FEI European Eventing Championships, which were hosted in the beautiful setting of Blenheim Palace, they saw Laura Collett and Tim McEwen win individual gold and bronze respectively. It's a fantastic achievement. And 2026, of course, is the first chance that teams have to qualify for the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. 6 British teams are going to be competing in the World Championships this August, as I'm sure you know. And our endurance team is also competing in Saudi Arabia, hopefully, the way things are going at the moment. So I just wanted to offer my best wishes, good luck to everyone involved in those championships. But the programme for this year's forum is interesting and varied, just as it was last year. And what it does is it highlights some of the real challenges that the equine industry has. I mean, I'm talking about things like climate change. I understand you're hearing about climate change later. And that affects things like forage production, of course. There are many financial challenges that riding schools and livery yards are facing. And also there are rising costs on horse owners more generally, leading to increased demand on equine rescue centres. And the government does recognise that many of these challenges are driven by very complex environmental, economic and geopolitical issues. And we're working really hard to try and mitigate their impacts on businesses and on individuals right across society. And my role in Defra, I think, is an important part to help with that, supporting organisations and groups such as yourselves. But also, among the challenges, there are some really exciting opportunities. I think something we've been discussing in Defra a lot is the role that artificial intelligence can play in improving equine health and welfare. And as part of our mission to strengthen our economic development, the UK government is working to accelerate AI uptake right across industry and establish the nation as a global frontrunner. I'm really interested to see how this can develop in the Equine Centre. I'm absolutely no doubt to the benefits this can bring. And in fact, I've actually asked the department to do their AI training so I can better understand what the possibilities are. Another exciting development is the government's reset of the relationships with the EU, as just mentioned by Roly. And what we're trying to do is to reduce barriers to trade and to boost economic growth by making it simpler and cheaper to move commodities, including live animals, to and from the EU. And we believe that the benefits of this will be far-reaching and will support economic growth while maintaining our biosecurity. And I'm sure you're aware that as part of the reset, the UK and EU have agreed to enter into the SPS agreement, as Roly referred to. Everyone seems to be really keen to know how this is going. I get asked about it regularly, as it's going to be my responsibility to deliver the Defra elements of it. and also what it means to them individually and what it means to people's businesses. We are currently engaged in the negotiations. They began last November, and we're aiming to complete negotiations and have legislation in place no later than 2027. But clearly a lot of that is subject to the discussions with the EU and the progress that is made. We are making good progress. I can reassure people of that. But obviously, one of the most frustrating things at the moment is while the negotiations are happening, I'm really unable to say very much about it. But hopefully, as we move forward, there's another round of meetings taking place in June. We should have a much better idea by then and be able to give people more information. We're also looking at how we can give businesses as much information and notice as possible as far ahead of any decisions that they will need to be making. So business readiness is one of the key things that we are working on. And we will be making announcements fairly shortly on that. But again, please do feel, I mean, my door is open. If you are concerned or need to know more, please do get in touch with Defra. We do want to make sure that we work with people closely on these matters. But also, in parallel with the SPS agreement work, I'm also very aware of the numerous benefits in making improvements to equine identification and traceability and the regime we run in Defra. This came up very strongly in last year's forum. And I've had some very good, productive conversations with both Roly and David about what I can do, what we can do in Defra to support this. And I know that they've been working hard with my officials to explore possibilities. I had a meeting last week to discuss this with officials. And this is one of the policy areas where we don't know yet what the exact impact's going to be of the SPS agreement. And how the outcome of the negotiations are going to affect it. But having said that, in the interim, we are looking to work with industry to explore what we can achieve in the meantime. And as I say, we've already started those discussions. It's something I really feel we need to be moving forward on. We're also shortly going to be hearing from Dr. June Fanning, Ireland's Chief Veterinary Officer, on work that the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine is doing in response to Professor Patrick Wall's report on equine ID and traceability. Minister Hayden's recently published a report, and this report is highlighting the progress that is being made already in this area. And in Defra, we've been following this with real interest, given the similarities of our equine ID systems. And also, you know, as we know, the high volume of horses that move between our respective nations each year. And I'm really pleased that we have good working relationships with officials so that we can include data sharing and actually make progress together. Because equine ID is an area where close working between government and industry, I think, can genuinely make a huge impact in resolving real-world on-the-ground problems. And these often happen behind the scenes, but they also make an important contribution to the smooth running of businesses and of systems within the industry. I'll just give a few recent examples of this. We've been working to resolve issues with international equine movements, where there have been questions that have been relating to equine identification documents. Industry stakeholders and my officials have also worked together to identify the root causes of these issues. And stakeholders have provided information on the problems they've encountered and the impacts on their businesses and on equine welfare, both occurring and potential, because it's important to look forward as well. Defra officials have been able to use this information to great effect in working with other departments to resolve some of the issues and to consider any legal implications. I've been very keen to work across department on these issues. It's also helped to facilitate the smooth export and import processes for several hundred polo ponies that were coming to the UK from Argentina and the USA. So we are working proactively together. We are able to make a difference. Because it is extremely satisfying when we can make a difference, when we can see a positive outcome and smooth out problems before they escalate. Just before I close, I was interested to see the poll included the petition on fireworks. The issue around fireworks sits with the Department for Business and Trade because it's a trade issue because we purchase fireworks. But I just thought the group might be interested to know that this is something that concerns me, that the noise levels and the impacts on animals. So we are in discussions with DBT to look to see if there is potential for progress in this space. I think it's fair to say, though, that we are on the verge of some exciting times for many aspects of equine business and ownership. Technology and innovation is inevitably going to play their part, along with the continued working relationships and collaboration between industry and government, which I believe is so important in all of this. So I'd just like to thank you once again for inviting me here today to talk about the work that we've been doing in Defra, and I will do all I can to support and drive improvements alongside the implementation of the SBS agreement. So on that, can I also say thank you for your continued patience while the negotiations are taking place. And I'm really hoping we can see some genuine benefits come out of those negotiations. So thank you again. Sorry I've got to run away, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. And sorry you can't stay with us, but we really do appreciate your time that you've made for us today. So now we're going to move on to the Chief Veterinary Officer for Ireland, working with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. It was 2 years ago that our screens were filled with an RTE, the BBC of Ireland, about some pretty grim practices in an Irish slaughterhouse. And they do say that every cloud has a silver lining, and it's wonderful that the CVO for Ireland is here to very much bring that to life. June has been with the department for over 20 years and has been the CVO since 2025, and so very hugely experienced. Her love of animals apparently started when she was so high. She used to rescue every animal known to the good Lord. And indeed, when I asked her for her proudest equine moment, she said it was when my 13-2 pony had a really bad cut, a career-ending, potentially life-ending injury, of which she was very much part of the TLC love and care and the veterinary care of that pony. Delighted to say that the pony made a full recovery, and that spurred June to become a vet, and which we're delighted for, because that means today she stands before a CVO for Ireland to give us the silver lining of a cloud from 2024. June, over to you.
Thanks, Roly. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. So, let's start with the crisis. On a Wednesday in June 2024, RTE, which is our national broadcaster, aired a documentary, RTE Investigates Horses Making a Killing. And what people saw them shook them to their core. They saw gaps in the traceability system. They saw horses fraudulently re-identified. They saw animals manipulated into the food chain. But most disturbingly, they saw horrific footage of horses destined for slaughter being beaten and abused on the premises adjacent to that slaughter plant. The public reaction was immediate. There were protests held, parliamentary questions, countless headlines, social media outrage, and I suppose there was huge, intense scrutiny and criticism of the Department of Agriculture. But this is where I think the really important story begins. It's the story of what comes next. The media spotlight was an important catalyst in igniting progress, because sometimes progress is born from criticism, and its spotlights can help illuminate a path forward. So, as the Minister mentioned, there was a report, but before I get to that, Ireland is a nation of horse people, from breeding to racing to sport and leisure horses. The equine industry is woven into our cultural and economic fabric. It's an important employer, supporting tens of thousands of direct and indirect jobs in breeding, racing and training. The thoroughbred breeding and racing sector alone is worth an estimated 2.5 billion to the Irish economy annually. but people's trust was shaken, and we can't take public acceptance for granted in a changing world. So we had to reassure the public, and we needed to respond decisively, not only to improve welfare and to restore that trust and protect the industry, but also to protect individual horses, most importantly. So in considering how to move forward, we have to consider the industry itself. As the Minister touched on, it's a dynamic, international and fast-moving sector. But this dynamism also contributed to its vulnerability. So the documentary, I've gone too far. The documentary revealed something really painful to us, that our systems, which were built over decades, were no longer robust enough or fit for purpose. So within 3 weeks, we had to act decisively. We appointed Patrick Wall, as was mentioned earlier, who's an independent external expert. So Paddy is a vet, he's a medical doctor, he's former head of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. He conducted a comprehensive review and produced a report. But what I think really helped to make our response successful was we did not minimise the problem. We did not defend the system, and we didn't wait for the storm to pass. We acted decisively and converted this energy and crisis into a catalyst for change. So that report was published in January 2025 and presented to our Minister Hayden. So last March, Minister Hayden then published his action plan based on the recommendations from that report. And really importantly, that action plan did not have vague commitments. It did not use aspirational language. There were 38 concrete, tangible recommendations and actions built around five simple headings. So outlined there in the slide, there's better accountability through better traceability. Part of that is to ensure that there's a responsible, accountable person for every horse. And in that way, that person is responsible for their welfare and their care. Stronger enforcement, which is a really important thing, built on proactive inspections. Thirdly, and a really important point, was improved protection at end of life is a key priority for us to ensure that horses are humanely treated. Optimising the use of science and technology to improve traceability, which the Minister touched on earlier. And then, really importantly, communication. Consulting experts, keeping those two-way communication channels open with industry, and educating the public. So what we learned was reform does not happen, and we're all aware of this, does not happen because you write a report. Reform only happens when you work together with industry to change behaviour. So, what do we do to change that behaviour, to try and drive that change? As is mentioned, horses move internationally, probably more so than other livestock. Last year alone, 20,000 horses left Ireland, half of those coming here to GB. So those movements, they create opportunities, such as was mentioned earlier, but also a risk. So we strengthened our export controls. From September 2024, horses could not be exported without being properly registered on our central equine database. In addition, the food chain information on their passport had to match the food chain information on our central database, regardless of what they were being exported for. So what was the result of this? In non-breeding thoroughbreds, ownership registration doubled compared to 2023, the previous year. So this was because we had embedded a compliance requirement into a critical control point. If you wanted to move your horse, you had to comply. So the learning from this was, if you want a behaviour to change, you have to build it into life events. So building on this experience, we I suppose, looked at horses and owners and the life events. So every horse has to register as a foal, changing ownership, maybe change of name. So at each of these life events, we now require confirmation of a horse's location. So we turned these life events into traceability checkpoints, if you want. Another example is our National Equine Census, which initially we asked people to engage on a voluntary basis, that it showed that they cared about welfare and that welfare was important to them. Unfortunately, I suppose initially the return rate was about 52%, which was disappointing. However, the following year, we linked completion of the census to being able to carry out registration of a foal. So if you didn't return a census, your equine premises number was deactivated, and as a result, then you wouldn't be able to register a foal or export a horse. So was it inconvenient? Yes, it was a little, but I suppose more importantly, was it effective? And it absolutely was. So I suppose we learned you do need a carrot, but unfortunately you also do need a stick. Consultation and collaboration and communication, I suppose. In changing behaviour, we also needed to listen to industry. It's so important that we worked with industry. So last July, we consulted publicly, and what we learned was really, I suppose, revealing and important. So there's no doubt the commitment of the industry is really strong. However, their knowledge of their responsibilities was quite varied. So I suppose you could see this as a failure, but we didn't. It's an opportunity, because if people care, education empowers them. So we simplified systems, we clarified roles, and we strengthened communication. And something else, I suppose, became really clear and very important was the power of champions for change. We in government departments can send out a message, and they're excellent messages, all of them. But unfortunately, not everybody listens to us. But when that message is echoed by industry leaders and industry voices, people really, really listen. So when racing yards, breeders, sport horse leaders reinforce reform, it becomes shared ownership of that reform and not just regulation. Huge credit to our industry, which they have engaged so constructively on this, and it's been really great, and it definitely has accelerated progress. That's not working. Okay. So another really important factor is enforcement. Most people take very good care of their horses, and they're very responsible. And they want to see those that are not complying, I suppose, punished or pulled up on it type thing. So in 2025, we rolled out proactive risk-based inspections. And this visible enforcement helped to show that there were consequences for non-compliance, and it demonstrated fairness, and that fairness in turn builds trust. So perhaps the most important reform has been, to ensure accountability, has been the launch of our central equine database. So since 2024, we used the census data in 2024 to link horses to a profile. So if you look at this, is anonymized data, but it basically shows that every active premises has horses associated with it. And it's the first time that we've had this for horses, where horses have been linked to that. And then what we've also done is that life events such as registration, change of ownership, they're, I suppose, those traceability checkpoints. But it also, so owners can move horses in, they can move horses out. The requirement when they're moving out is they have to move to a valid equine premises number. But this ensures that horses are linked to an individual person who is responsible for ensuring their welfare. So everything I've said, there's been great progress. It's been a collective leadership effort by industry. I suppose great credit to my own team from the commitment and dedication that they've shown, but also with the support and leadership that our Minister, Minister Hayman, has provided. So Minister Hayman's commitment to the project and the wider horse sector has made a real tangible difference. People don't feel dictated to, they feel represented. They feel they have an ally and someone who's working with them, not imposing these actions on them. That has accelerated the trust. So we could not have come this far, this quickly, without industry partners and clear ministerial leadership. So, at the heart of all of this is something very simple. We all want the same thing: healthy, happy horses, a strong sport, and a future we can all be proud of. So how do we get to that future? What's planned? We plan to incorporate sales houses and training yards as traceability checkpoints, bringing transporters into the system, integrating into traces, so the data on our central database, once a horse leaves Ireland, it comes off our database, so that we only have the horses that are actually in Ireland on the database, increasing the accuracy. A move toward mandatory DNA profiling. Currently, it's about 80% of foals registered are DNA, have their DNA done as well. But in a global world of movement, identity must be verifiable, and ultimately DNA may become one of the strongest guardians of the integrity of that system. Another thing we feel is really important is we want to tackle late registration. In 2024, 25% of those registered were over 12 months of age, which automatically means they are marked out of the food chain. Experience has told us and shown us that this can leave horses vulnerable to neglect at the end of life. So we hope to ensure that as many horses as possible retain their eligibility for the food chain. The lessons learned. I'll leave you with 3 lessons, maybe not just about horses, but crisis in general. As they say, never waste a crisis. The momentum is short-lived. The public attention fades and outrage cools. If we don't act when we have that energy, you could lose the opportunity to make real progress. Some of the reforms we implemented were on long-term wish lists for years, and the crisis accelerated that timeline. It's really important to link behaviour to pressure points to drive change. We saw that compliance increased most when registration, export, and movement depended on it. Critical control points drive engagement. So in any sector, trying to implement reform, ask where those equivalent life events are and where are the leverage moments. And thirdly, I cannot stress enough the importance of building relationships and strong communications. This, as I said, was a collective leadership and collaboration. It did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because of industry positivity and engagement. Without that buy-in from equine owners and stakeholders, we would not be where we are now. Consultation, it strengthened our reforms, but strong communication, that two-way communication, sustains them. But if we step back for just a minute from it, I suppose this is not just a story about horses, it's not just a story about Ireland. It's about what happens when a trusted system is exposed under a harsh light. So we could have responded defensively, we absolutely could, or you can respond constructively. So any crisis, it tests leadership and resilience, but it also reveals an opportunity. And I'm very proud of my team and our industry for their leadership and collaboration and how they've improved the system. In 2024, our equine sector was under intense scrutiny. 2026, we're building one of the most integrated traceability systems ever. That spotlight, which felt punitive, has been very productive. So the most important lesson of all is progress rarely begins in comfort, but it's important that we take the discomfort to turn it into meaningful change. So there's Mountie, my 13-2 pony. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you very much for listening.
June, thank you very much, and lovely to see Mountie there. So now, in terms of thinking about a changing world, of course, over the last decade or so and more, the environment has become an increasing challenge. And after the most dreadful winter that many of us can remember, although bizarrely, if you're in London today, it is the most gorgeous day, isn't it? So it's a real sort of a sort of sidebar there. But Katie is going to talk to us about the challenge for forage production in the UK. Katie is technical manager at Dengie Horse Feeds, and when I asked her about her favourite equestrian moment, she told me it was actually winning at the East of England, I think Suffolk Punch, Broodmare and Foal at Foot class in the 1990s when only 20 foals were born a year. So I imagine the classes were quite small, but. On the plus side, she won the class, but it was a second-generation foal that was born. So it was really quite something. So, Katie, over to you.
Thank you, Roly, I think. Morning, everyone, and thank you again to Neff for the invitation to be here. So I want to cast your minds back, actually, to 2025. Do you remember this? It seems like a distant memory now with all the wet weather that we've had perhaps over the last few months, but this was, and I think probably the term unprecedented is overused, but I think in terms of the weather in 2025, we can genuinely claim that it was unprecedented. So these sorts of images were in the media, reflecting the sort of water shortages due to the excessive sort of drought. More recently, and not that many days later, this is what we've been contending with, and this is hopefully setting the scene for some of the data that we've got to come in this presentation. But it is, I think, unprecedented in the sense that if you can see on the screen there, in March, April and May, we were experiencing, compared to the long-term average, significantly reduced levels of moisture rainfall. And actually, if you include February in that, that was below the long-term average as well. And then again, we had a very dry August. So all of those sorts of combined issues have come together to create the perfect storm, or should we say the perfect drought, because what it actually meant was that we had low forage yields because of that very dry spring. There was no bulk to the grass, so when you came to turn it into conserved forage, there was not much to go for. Then again, we had this dry August, and so there was no grazing and no pasture. So horse owners and other farmers, anyone keeping sort of herbivores, was having to use their forage sooner. So we had low production of forage in the first place, and we're having to use it sooner. And so I think we're getting to that crunch point now at the end of the winter where people are really starting to struggle and basically haven't got forage or are having to pay a huge amount for forage. The image here is basically just, and I'm not going to get into economic models, so nobody panic, but effectively what this illustration is trying to show is that if we have a fairly consistent demand and a fairly consistent supply, we have that magic world of an equilibrium, and so pricing is relatively stable. But as we've seen in sort of certainly in social media, and it has been widely discussed, in fact, even just eating my breakfast this morning, there were a couple of surveys starting to go out about whether you've run out of forage and how much more you're actually having to pay right now. If you're actually producing your own forage, or you've cannily secured some from the previous year, then you're probably in a very fortunate position of not having to pay more. And I think, relatively speaking, it's probably the equivalent of dynamic pricing and Oasis tickets, because there has certainly been a lot of profiteering going on by those that have forage to sell. So why does forage matter? Well, I'm sure I don't need to explain to anyone in the room here that forage is one of the 3 Fs, so contributing to the sort of fundamental welfare for the horse. And I would actually take it a step further than that, in the sense that the right forage and the right amount of the right forage are actually what we can do to try and create positive welfare for our horses. And how does climate change affect that? And certainly more in the sort of longer term, we're seeing an effect of the climate and the weather on the nutritional value and the nutritional properties of forages. So a feed company based in Europe presented their data from forage analysis over the last 8 years, which they presented at the UN conference a couple of years ago. And they reported in increasing numbers of forages containing very low protein levels. And their data set is huge. It's more than 20,000 samples that they've tested over that time, and they use near-infrared, so NIR, analysis techniques, which are relatively cost-effective. They might not be completely accurate, but they are giving you, with that amount of data, a good indication of the trend and the sort of direction of travel, really, in terms of nutritional parameters. And alongside that reduction in protein, they're actually highlighting that samples were containing more and more sugar. And the graph that you can hopefully see there is actually some analysis that at Dengie we carry out for customers, and it's around about 300 samples. That's actually analysed differently using more traditional wet chemistry techniques, but over time you can see how the WSC, which is the sugars sort of in the forage, is actually rising. So we're seeing the same that those samples in Europe are sort of basically returning. And what significance does that have for the horse owner or the horse carer? I'll go that way first. Basically, if forage is contributing less of those essential nutrients that we need for performance and breeding stock, then costs are going to go up because we're probably having to use more supplementary feed. The lower energy that's also associated with that might actually be quite useful in the context of a good doer or an overweight horse or pony, but the associated increase in the sugar content is certainly not helpful if you have an insulin dysregulated animal, some kind of metabolic issue, then this is not going to be desirable for a forage for your horse or pony. Just going back to why that actually happens, and I think if you can all recall your GCSE biology or O-level, then lots of light equals lots of photosynthesis. So what we're seeing with these really long, bright, sunny days is that plants will accumulate sugar. And if they're under drought or heat stress, they're going to maturity much quicker. So they become more fibrous, they're going to seed, a bit like the bolted lettuce. If you do grow your own veg, if it gets away from you and goes to maturity before you can harvest it, then it tends to be more bitter, it's more fibrous, the nutritional value has declined. But because we've got all that light, all that photosynthesis occurring, the sugar is actually accumulating in the plant itself. So any stressed plant is going to try and go to seed, and that is where we have these sorts of reductions in the protein, the energy, but the increase in sugar. And we know that horse owners want to feed forage. With the increased prevalence of gastric ulcers and awareness of that, we did a survey back in 2021 through the Horse and Hound sort of social media. We got 650 responses, I think largely because it was in the pandemic, so people had nothing better to do but complete a survey. But 41% of them, and these were owners of good doers, were stating that they were worried about not feeding enough forage in the context of gastric ulcers. So horse owners are conditioned now to feeding forage, and getting the right forage is very frustrating for them. So what can we do? Well, is straw the answer? I suppose in some contexts it would be. It's naturally much lower in non-structural carbohydrate and energy values. It's relatively affordable, and I would say relatively available. So it is at the vagaries of the weather as well, just like your grass-based forages are, but actually it could offer us a much more affordable, hopefully more widely available forage that we can top up, particularly for these good doers, overweight horses, etc. There are some concerns, and I'm a member of the Beta Nops committee, looking at Claire across there. We do have to be aware of what might also be lurking in the straw. So things like weeds that might not be popping up in your grass-based forages could well be in your cereal-based ones. But if you're not competing under rules, then you don't need to worry about that. And of course, we've got the concern of potential health issues with poor dentition and a history of colic, then straw might not be for you. But again, we've got to look at what is the greatest threat to the horse and welfare. Health and welfare are things that go hand in hand, and we've got to kind of ensure that we're getting, I suppose, the priorities right for that horse. Just dismissing straw because we're worried about some of the things that might happen and not having the right forage for them to use in the short term, it doesn't really make any sense. I just thought I'd touch on some of the other forages that are grown in the UK. Obviously, I'm very familiar with alfalfa or lucerne, two names for the same plant. It is drought tolerant, and I've emphasised the tolerance because it is affected by the weather. Yes, it has deep roots, so it can access water from much further down than grass can, but it still is impacted. And you can see in the data that we've collated, we have over 20 years. It just shows how long I've been working at Dengie, but we have a relatively consistent collection of data over that 20 years, and you can see that the average yield is showing a downward trend. In the last 20 years, we've had 4 occasions when harvest has actually finished in September, and all 4 of those have occurred since 2020. So normally we would start in late April or May and run right the way through to October, but you can see that the weather is starting to have an impact on how long our harvest period actually is. And I don't want to cause unnecessary panic because there's plenty in the shed, but it is just the fact that we've got to plan for this and accept that if yields are going to go down, our overheads are still the same, so costs potentially are going to increase. And I think it's interesting that the short or long harvest periods don't necessarily correlate with the number of drying days that we get. So interruptions can happen at any time, and that can be because it's too wet or too dry. If there's no regrowth, because we cut 4 times a year, then you are actually, you don't go out, there's nothing to go and harvest. So too wet and too dry can be just as problematic. And as I hopefully showed at the beginning, the timing of the rain is everything, both within a year and year on year. One of the lowest yields we've had is when a warm summer followed a very wet winter. It was very late to get started, and then you haven't got much regrowth. So it's that perfect storm again, similar to 2025. What does the future look like? To echo June's thoughts, really, challenges usually create opportunities, and I think novel crops will be the way we go. So things like chia, quinoa, teff, they're already being grown, some of them in the UK, and some are obviously well established as feeds for horses or forages for horses in other countries. Again, they're not without their issues. Teff, for example, is a great forage for the good doer because it's low in NSC, but it contains synephrine, which is a prohibited substance. So we do have to be mindful that they're not without their issues either. But again, if you're not competing under rules, that might be a forage of the future in the UK. And as George revealed, if ever you needed any evidence that climate change was happening, then in 2025, the number of vineyards in the UK increased to more than 1,000 for the first time. And I think that resonates with me, particularly living and working in Essex, because there are more and more popping up in Essex. And not only are we fighting for agricultural space with solar farms, houses, and now we have vineyards to contend with too. So I think that's me. I'm very happy to answer any questions, and there's my proudest moment. It's a very old photo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If you can come and take a seat. And June, if you wouldn't mind coming up too. Unfortunately, we haven't got the Minister. If you've got a question for the Minister, you could ask me, and as I said earlier, I'll probably be right in sometime in 10 years. But in fact, the first question on Slido is why can't the UK do what the Republic of Ireland has done on digital ID? I can answer that question. That is funding. Government funding and priorities is a simple answer. But June, on that perspective, is there any sort of advice or thoughts you have in terms of the experience that Ireland has had compared to where the GB, Great Britain, is currently at the moment?
So I suppose the Minister touched on it as to we do work very closely. The competent authorities work very closely together. I suppose because of, I was talking with Jan earlier, because of, I suppose, our industry are so intrinsically linked. You know, if you look back to when we had the tripartite agreement, there is an awful lot of movement between the industries type thing. So I suppose it has been very important. We've worked very closely with Northern Ireland and obviously GB as well in trying to ensure that there is that integration of the systems because, and we do have good feedback in that with UK colleagues in relation to horses that say move to the UK because it's I suppose it's about closing the gaps and that's, you know, there's been lots of progress but there's always improvements that we can make.
Any burning questions from the floor? There's one at the back there, so if we could take that very quickly. If you could keep your question nice and tight, just so we can get through.
Right, Siobhan Dillon, Applied Equine Podiatry. So basically looking at the crisis that you had, very often those bad things happen because of about 5% of the population. So you're imposing or bringing in a lot of behaviour change for a wide population that ordinarily would be probably looking after their horses properly. How do you know that you're actually catching that 5% that are really bad with the processes that you're using right now? And are you changing their behaviour? Because it's their behaviour that we really need to be changing rather than necessarily the masses.
Thanks. So yeah, it is, as you say, it's a small cohort that can undermine that trust in the whole industry. And it is about, it's that incremental change to ensure that we're making it more and more difficult for people to circumvent the rules. So unfortunately, there are likely to always be people who are going to put more effort into trying to circumvent the rules than actually it would take to actually apply them. But it is by sort of building on the requirements that we feel we are, I suppose, narrowing that gap and clamping down on it. And I suppose that enforcement piece is really important. So we have, I suppose, I covered the proactive approach. So it's premises in particular that would have a lot of horses moving through them, acting as possibly assembly centres. We've changed our assembly centre rules. And then there's Intel. We work very closely with An Garda Síochána, which is our police force, as well. So it is trying to clamp down on that smaller cohort, which can undermine. But the message that's been really important is we do have to, raise the whole industry's requirements to ensure that we continue to build a strong industry, look after individual horses, because whilst there's responsible owners, horses change hands. And just because you or I may be a responsible owner, it's where they end up when the next person sells them on. It's important that we can maintain their welfare then.
Certainly that collective responsibility is so important, working together. Katie, there's a question from Alice here. Can you share who is responsible for the recent forage surveys and where the results will be published?
Yes, the one I was looking at over breakfast was Ask Animal Web. I think they're just about to launch their forage, and I think the other one was a charity, but I can share that later. It was over breakfast this morning that I noticed them.
Brilliant. Listen, thank you. There's so many questions here, but I'm afraid we haven't got time to get through them. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Katie, to June, and to the Minister, and we'll move now back to Tim.